Hi, I'm Julie Thompson. Welcome to the Duxbury School Committee Candidate Interviews. I want to take a moment to thank the candidates for participating in this interview and collaborating with PAC TV to bring this informational programming to residents and voters this election season. Let me explain the format. We will be conducting a one-on-one interview style Q&A format with each candidate, lasting about 30 minutes. Responses will not be timed, and follow-up questions may be asked during this format. We aim to ask up to 4 or 5 questions, but that will depend on the length of the responses, along with any follow-up discussion during this exchange. Candidates will be allowed to address anything not covered or that they'd like to add clarification to at the end of the interview in their closing remarks. Let's get started. Today we are speaking with Katie Cleary, one of the 3 candidates for school committee in the Duxbury town election. Katie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're going to have a bunch of questions. We're going to have 30 minutes, and we're going to start with question number 1. Okay. One of the many responsibilities of a school committee member is to advocate on behalf of students and their schools and to promote the benefits of the school system to the community. What impression do you want to give of the Duxbury school system, and how would your advocacy showcase all that the district has to offer?
So, I think the Duxbury public school system is a strong and healthy district with so many different opportunities for our students. And I think that, you know, my role on school committee would be to sort of showcase some of the areas where we really shine with regards to promoting like inclusion and offering different programs to kids on a wide spectrum of learning abilities. I think that I would want to show the community that we have a strong core of teachers that we work hard to retain, and that at the end of the day, you know, that is kind of our strongest element is our educators. Our district is in an interesting place right now, coming off of 2 years of, you know, real instability to for everyone. And so I think that we really want to show the community that we're working hard to bring everyone back and get everyone back on the same page and sort of give kids the confidence again that they can come to school and learn and that teachers can do their job. So I think overall, just with regards to showing the community strengths, you know, we really want to focus on not necessarily scores and tests and data and assessment, but sort of the people we're producing and the people who work within the buildings, that we are and they are just passionate about what they do, and that they, at the end of the day, are all there for the kids.
We had reached out to the community to ask for questions regarding the candidates, and one of the things was the front-facing promotion of the Duxbury schools, like in the newspapers, often sports. An awful lot of time is given to the sports, which is wonderful. You have a wonderful sports department, obviously, and it spans all the grades. But there's more to Duxbury schools than sports. So how would you circle that square and make sure that all the things and all the programs that the Duxbury public schools offer kind of have the chance to be in the limelight?
I think that we have a town paper that does a good job of that in a lot of ways, because they promote our theater department and our art department and these core areas. We have a lot of kids in our community who do various things that are not athletically driven. So I think that, you know, we have administrators who work hard to promote a lot of those activities, particularly at schools like Alden. They are always mentioning the art pieces, and the high school has this amazing drama department that my oldest son can't wait to get to. So I think that as a school committee, you know, obviously we have student reps, and I think it would be great if those student reps could also speak to the various things going on at the schools at each meeting, just to represent the whole community, because I agree with you. I think a lot is focused on athletics, and it's great. Like, everyone has kids who, you know, do different things, but I think as a district as a whole, we shine in a lot of other areas. We have a robotics team. We have different programs. We have science fairs that are incredible, and from the youngest grades, they allow kindergartners the opportunity to do projects. So I think that, and like I said, we do have a town newspaper that focuses on that, but I wish as a district as a whole we were known as a place where kids can come and be included for whatever, activity they find interesting and that they like shine in.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea of having a student come to your meetings and just give a little presentation on their initiatives or their programs or what they're involved with.
It would be great. And they do. They have student reps now, but I think that that's sort of my hope for school committee is that we make it a bit more of an engaging session where some of the agenda items allow for a bit more community involvement.
Okay, excellent. Okay, question number 2. When it comes to decision making, it can be a process to balance opposing views, and when working towards a solution, it's not always easy. As an advocate for families and educators, how do you manage the decision making process when there is no simple, straightforward path to a resolution?
I think this has been a lot. This has gone on a lot, I should say, just recently. And as contrite and cheesy as it sounds, it's been a lot of us versus them instead of we. So I think that getting opinions and having conversations regarding some of these topics, there's a lot more power and strength in finding out where everyone lies and what everyone's input is, and then sort of kind of working backward to figure out how those various opinions can come closer to the goal we're looking at. With educators and with parents, there's always going to be probably some differences with regards to, frankly, opinions and where you are. But we, again, going back to my first question, we hire educators because they are the experts and they are the ones who know how to educate. And and parents in general know their children and they know their hopes for them and what they want out of their education. But they certainly aren't always the experts, and I believe their voices absolutely matter, as does the whole community. But I think when it's hard to get to a resolution, we need to take a step back and look at what's best for the educational advancement of the kids. I think at the end of the day, that needs to be where the decision comes, and it needs to be less about opinions and personalities and more about what is the path that's going to help them at the end of the day achieve what they want from an educational perspective.
Outcomes.
Yeah.
Outcomes are the more important. Let me follow up with a question about this. So social media is obviously widespread, and do you see that it affects decision-making for boards and committees? And should a school committee member engage in an online discussion or a debate about anything to do with the schools on social media?
No. Full stop.
Okay.
I don't think, if social media is impacting your opinion and your decision-making skills, you probably need to reevaluate where you're at and why you're doing this. Again, everyone has an opinion, and that's what you're entitled to. But when it comes to decisions, as particularly with school committee, it needs to involve the 5 members, the educational community, and of course the outside community, but in a thoughtful and dignified, for lack of a better word, process. And social media is never any of those things typically. I think it's a great sounding board for people to come together and, for parent communities particularly, to have a place where they can get information and where content can be posted about meetings and things going on at the school. But I do not believe that if you are representing a committee, regardless of your personal account, that you should engage in comments.
What if somebody puts something out there that is absolutely incorrect? Like you had a meeting last night and the committee voted on something, and then someone comments on it the next day and clearly did not get the vote right. So the information now is out there in the ether and it's not right.
Correct. I can see the need to then, say, I encourage you to look back at the meeting. I encourage you to reach out to one of us. Here's the school committee email. I think going to sources is more important. So if it's just a blatant incorrect statement or lie, I can see engaging in that matter, but not with anything other than a factual statement or an encouragement to reach out to a member. I think there's a fine line there, but
go to the source.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Makes sense. Okay. Question number 3. School budgets can make up a significant percentage of the town budget. How do you get the best bang for the dollar when balancing the district's contracts, the curriculum, the student needs, the facility upkeep, and obviously technology, while trying to keep the budget within a reasonable range?
You know, the budget is probably the trickiest piece of a lot of this. And I think that engagement from the community is really important. And I don't think, in my own opinion, that we have a lot of that right now to the level that we need. And so I think that taking a budget and actually looking at it from an individual school level is really important. You know, we have 4 schools in our district. People are invested in the different schools depending on where your children lie.
Sure.
And as a community at whole, I understand that, you know, everyone's interested in the budget because it impacts the whole town, obviously. It's where our tax dollars go. But I think that taking a step back and really looking at a budget line by line probably isn't going to happen for a lot of people. So it's better to hopefully try to find a way to hit people where they're invested and help them understand at the lower level, you know, like this is how this impacts the day-to-day operations of the school and your teachers and your kids. I do think it would be worthwhile to you know, do a thoughtful approach to looking at where we're spending and how, like, where our gaps are. This year they did a survey they sent out to the whole community asking for where people's concerns were, where their interests were, you know, where they saw gaps. And I think that was hugely beneficial because it was really, you were able to see what do students think are important and what do parents think are important. And what do educators, but then also what do people who don't have children in the schools? Like, where do they feel that the money should be spent? And at the end of the day, it's, you know, a school district is only as strong as its teachers. And so we need to ensure that we're paying them well and keeping them and retaining them. And so I think, you know, it's not always about like the flashy stuff. It's more about the nitty gritty, like investment. And I think that's hard to do always to get everybody's engagement, but we need to work harder to bring people in where it's meaningful to them.
Right. So during the budget process for the school, do you take line by line in your school committee meetings over the course of however long the budget process goes? So you literally, so anybody who is watching a school committee meetings could actually see every single line item and you talk about it?
They don't in the meetings. You can have that opportunity to look at that outside of it. And they do a wonderful job actually, but they present more sort of high level, like new FTEs that might be coming in that they're advocating for, any sort of...
what's an FTE for anyone?
I'm sorry, a full-time employee, like, you know, if they're hiring a new math teacher at the high school, like, and then sometimes there's different percentages for how full-time they are.
Yep.
And then any sort of, not sort of capital expenses, because that comes from something else, but if there's different initiatives or technology support, things like that, they're really pretty transparent on a lot of that. So it is, but as of right now, it's this long meeting. And like I said, not everybody's invested in the same manner. So I think finding a more thoughtful way to get that investment from the community would be beneficial, just to get people, it's hard to say the majority of our budget goes to the schools. If you're not really telling everyone where that's going and how it's benefiting the kids, and then how they're turning that around to make our entire district healthier and stronger.
Right. So what about the thought that you don't have to pay for everything? What can you get out of people or your society or whatever that you can bring into the schools that isn't going to add to the budget? How often is that thought about in the Duxbury school system?
I think it's thought about a lot. It was in our strategic plan, actually. You know, some of the pillars revolved a lot around expanding learning opportunities for kids, looking at kind of like global and local perspectives and offering them more opportunities to learn differently, because I do think that we need to meet a lot of kids where they're at, and not everyone's on this college path that's their end goal and their dream. So we are so fortunate to live in the community we do, and there's so many resources, and I think that is something that I would really like to approach more heavily, is looking at our community as a whole and where we have opportunities to leverage some of the areas that either people work in or businesses and things like that. They've done a lot recently with like our maritime school and we have Island Creek Oysters and other companies that have really offered their services, so to speak, but to help like bring different opportunities to our kids. But I do think that on that level we in my opinion need to do a better job of leveraging what's out there.
Okay, excellent. And we'll get back to something you said about college in a minute.
Okay.
Question 4. The school district has recently handled some personnel matters in a very public way.
Yep.
In situations like this, how does a school committee member balance the need for transparency and providing information in a timely manner with the need to follow the process and to follow the law?
Absolutely. I actually think that this year has looked a lot different communication-wise from our schools, and I applaud them. I think they've done the best they can to really be more transparent. Parents pushed for that a lot last year, and it's come a long way, and I do think, so from that perspective, it's getting better. I think as a school committee member, as you said, there are laws and there are rules, so it's important to give enough information that the community is made aware that something's going on, but not everything they're not privy to every bit of information, and that's a fine line, and that's hard, and I understand when it involves your children, you want to know everything from A to Z, but unfortunately, that's not always allowed, and people are protected to privacy rights by law, and so I think with regards to transparency, the emails this year and the information has given what they can. They've let us know what's going on. School committee has worked harder to encourage that from the administration, and I think it's gotten so much better. And I think at the end of the day, people just have to understand that if it was about you too, you wouldn't want all that information out there either. So you have to take a step back and understand that they are doing what they need to do by law, and that they will let you know when there's something that they can tell you.
Okay. So how can a school committee take what has happened in the past and make sure that it doesn't happen again? I mean, dealing with it because it's happened is one thing.
Yep.
But how do you then inform your future policies, procedures to make sure that you're not sitting around the table discussing this again in 2 years?
2 years. No, that's great. I think we have so many policies in place, and at the end of the day, we've hired a superintendent who has hired principals, who has hired administrators that they know are capable and able to lead. So I think it's important to look at our policies, understand where they are, and then meet with administrators and such to find out kind of where the gaps are. And if it is a gap in like knowledge or training or education, that's one piece, and that's where you can sort of change the policy and make it more tangible and more, you can bring in support and figure out ways to sort of fill those gaps. But if it's more of a practice issue, it involves like administration, and it involves school committee saying, as a whole, like, we need to examine this practice and we need to figure out how to hire the right people so that this doesn't happen again, or how to bring programs to our kids to make sure that they have a better understanding of why this was wrong and why it can't happen again. And again, that comes down to resources, but I think that we have to find like a balance of understanding where we need to kind of spend money on trainings and where we can sort of do it internally as a district, and make sure our policies are sort of zipped up so that they don't allow those things to happen again.
And what about, just as a final thought on this subject, how do you present the information to students, teachers, parents, school committee members, other members of the community, how you can speak up? Where do you go to? Who do you say what to?
So are you saying if there's an incident or just in general?
Anything that comes up that needs further scrutiny.
Yeah. No, I think, You want to go, with regards to students, I've seen meetings this year where we've talked about going to the person they trust. And I think that's different for all students. So, educators carry a lot of burden because they are responsible for a lot of things these days. And I think so, but for a lot of kids, that's who they trust. So that's who they'd go to. I would encourage parents to reach out to school committee as a whole. I do believe that should be a first stop. If it's a particular issue within a certain school that, they've able to identify exactly what's going on, reach out to administrators. I mean, you talk to your teachers. I just think, I don't know, there's so much power in really communicating and getting involved and engaged, and you can't complain about something unless you're willing to back it up and really make an effort to make a difference. So I think that you have to be willing to have hard conversations too. And I've never reached out and not had someone say, let's talk. So I think that has kind of gotten lost in the shuffle too, where people are afraid to speak. And we've done that, I think, as a society and as a community. We've done that, but we need to bring that back a little bit and really say there needs to be transparency, and there needs to be a willingness that even if your opinions differ, you're willing to chat. But we have a strong administrative team, and we have great educators. So I think the first stop should be there, and that school committees need to be, again, engaged and willing to talk and not
part of that cycle. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a bonus question.
Okay.
What you decide during your time on the school committee will affect the students of tomorrow. How far into the future do you look to see the impact you could make as a school committee member right now?
I think that it's a reasonable statement to say I would look 3 to 5 years, which I think to make any, first of all, we're coming off of 2 years of a global pandemic that impacted everyone in any way you look at it. So we had a strategic plan put in place in 2019, and frankly haven't been able to do a lot of it. We've done a lot, but I don't think they've been able to meet everything. And so I think realistically it's going to take another year or two to sort of get footing back and get things, even not back to pre-pandemic levels, but just back to status quo a little bit. So I think if we can look 3 to 5 years out and say, where do we want to be then? That's probably most realistic. I mean, I think it's important to also think about where we want to be next month and at the end of the school year, and from so many different perspectives.
Yeah. What about this? Okay, over the past decade or so, the focus the focus on post-secondary education would always be which college you're going to go to. You're going to go to college. Now, people are looking at the trades. They're looking at certificate programs. The whole idea that you go to school, you go to 12th grade, then you should go on to college is completely changed. The landscape of that has changed. So how do you, curriculum-wise, decide? I mean, you mentioned a robotics group, right? Okay, 10, 15 years ago, there was no robotics. So how do you adjust to the landscape of what these kids are going to be looking at in 5, 10, 15 years? Because what you do now matters. It's
so hard from a budgetary standpoint, because we need that focus on core curriculum, and that is certainly where our kids, that's the function of a public school and with regards to education, but it's also the function of a public school to kind of expose our kids to some opportunities that they might not get at home and things like that. So I think we're working hard internally, from what I've seen, to create some of these other opportunities. And, I hear about things going on at high school and whatnot. It would be great if we could start at lower levels too, to give kids the opportunity to take some classes or have some programs that are a little outside the box for them. And I think, with regards to budgetary constraints, that's where it comes down to these thoughtful processes where we say we need to ensure that we're meeting kids where they're at, and that we're there's like differentiated learning opportunities for everyone, because not everyone is on this linear path. And so it's not like you can look at every student and say, okay, so what are you interested in? And we'll work on that. But I think that it's important to find these sort of, buckets of like areas or programs where we can bring some opportunities into kids. And again, that goes back to the resources you mentioned. We have so many in the community, and I think that that's where, if anything came out of the last year, it was that parent engagement matters, and it matters a lot, and community engagement matters, and that if you have those opportunities to bring things to the schools to help, by all means, please speak up, because I think the schools get a lot of complaints often, and they don't always hear good things, but there are so many good things to be brought out about what our schools are already doing and what they could be doing. Right. And I think that that's one way to do it, is to utilize community resources that might not cost anything, like you mentioned previously.
Exactly. Okay, great. In our last about 4 minutes, is there anything that we didn't discuss that you want to bring up?
Not so much that we didn't discuss, but I do think that, part of the reason I wanted to be in school committee is to look at our engagement. And we talked a lot about communication, but I just think that we have so much room for opportunity to make our district healthier and stronger. And I really believe that if we can empower our educators to feel like they can do their primary job again. That's my personal opinion, but as a country as a whole and everything, I think that education is in this like really interesting spot right now, and I'm a really strong believer in public schools. I think that they can do so much for our kids, and that there's so many opportunities there, and so I want to get back to sort of having this, I said it earlier, like a we relationship instead of this us versus them. And I don't want it to be that teachers are bogged down with doing so many other things that they can't do their jobs, basically. Okay.
So in the last couple of minutes, why don't you just look at that camera and tell people why you're running and a little bit about your background.
Sure. My family and I moved to Duxbury almost 9 years ago. We had one child. We now have 3 in the Duxbury public school systems. I grew up out in Colorado. I have a master's degree in education and am actually currently working towards an accelerated degree in nursing. So basically everything I've ever done from an education standpoint was to help others and to give back to the community. I grew up with parents who were really involved in my schools and in my education, and I promised myself that when I had kids I would do the same thing. So that is what I've done. I've been the president of the Chandler PTA. I'm currently the treasurer. I was on Chandler School Council and was on the 2019 Strategic Planning Committee. I am running for school committee because I really believe that it's a vital element in our town and in our schools, and that there is so much room for collaboration across the board from educators, administrators, and the community, and that I just want to be part of that process and someone who can hopefully facilitate positive changes and improve everything in our schools from an education and a programming standpoint, and just to make sure that over the next few years we get better and our kids feel really good about saying they go to Duxbury Public Schools.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks Katie for participating in this interview. We wish you the best of luck throughout your campaign and in the election. Today we're speaking with Sean Datsatan Foley, one of the 3 candidates for school committee in Duxbury town election. Sean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions, and we're going to time it for 30 minutes, and here we go. One of the many responsibilities of a school committee member is to advocate on behalf of students and their schools and promote the benefits of the school system to the community. What impression do you want to give of the Duxbury school system, and how would your advocacy showcase all that the district has to offer?
Absolutely. So one of the things that my family and I first experienced when we moved to Duxbury is that there was excitement around talking about, one of 2 things: it's the beaches and the schools. And for us, that was a clear introduction as to how much pride and how much history the school community has played in the role of Duxbury and how that has formed this community. And I think it's one of those opportunities where we see this growth and this transition in education and a desire to make sure that our school district is following that growth and that trend towards, COVID forced us into this kind of free fall into educational technology, but educational technology was always the ultimate goal for the educational landscape. Doing online, doing remote work, being as equitable as possible to bring education into every single household. Being able to bring education to your non-traditional, learners. So when we talk about how do we advocate for a district, we need to make sure that our district is performing to the standards that we want them and we expect them to be performing in. And I think you can pull that out of a lot of the individuals and a lot of the communities and a lot of the additional work that's happening in the Duxbury community around education. You have incredible support programs. You have amazing extracurriculars. You have the Duxbury Student Union. You have the Duxbury Education Fund. And these are all entities that are doing some incredible work, but the communication lines don't seem to necessarily be there in an intentional way so that one can benefit from the other and benefit from the other. So when I'm thinking about how do we advocate for a district to grow as best as possible, we want to be able to grab those individuals, those stories, and we want to be able to highlight them as best as possible. And we also want to be as reflective of what the history of Duxbury has been like, but we also want to create a space that's opening and welcoming to individuals who may not necessarily identify in a community that is what Duxbury is right now. We want to bring in talent, we want to bring in diversity, we want to not just bring it in, but we also want to create this sense of belonging. We want to create a space where somebody can step into Duxbury and say, I absolutely belong here, and no one's going to make me feel like I'm othered or part of a community that just was never meant to be here.
Right.
So I think when we're talking about that growth and that aspect of how do we advocate, we do it from a place where we talk about how Duxbury is a place for human beings first.
Okay.
Because that's what we are. We're human beings before we're students.
Right, absolutely. Now, I've noticed, people have written in when we ask for questions, that an awful lot of the coverage of Duxbury is the sports. Now, how do you circle that square with the fact that there's so many other programs, and granted the sports program is wonderful in Duxbury, how do you give the same highlight to other types of programs that go on in the whole school system?
Sure. I mean, sports are exciting. Sports tend to be in the fabric of a lot of our lives. I was a collegiate baseball player, so for me, sports is very much an exciting thing. I can drive past a high school baseball field and just, spend 15 minutes watching two teams that I've never seen before, and enjoy every second of it. But when we're talking about how do we advocate or how do we support those programs that aren't as glorified or do not get the entire complexes created to support this, I think that's where we need to double down into exploring some of these creative options, doing some partnerships with local universities to really bring some value to these young learners who can then project what the skill set can provide for them in terms of professional opportunity or just enhancing their own day-to-day life. I think we have a great opportunity. Duxbury's median age is 54 years old, so we have this huge untapped resource of intergenerational learning, whether it happens with local universities, whether it happens with other school districts, or whether it happens with professionals who are sitting in our own backyard. We need to be able to take advantage of that and lean into the experience and expertise that those individuals have. Because I think that's, aside from dipping our hands into this hidden pocket of funds where we could just throw thousands of dollars at programs and make them as flashy as possible, we need to start tapping into those resources that we already have.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Second question. When it comes to decision making, it can be a process to balance opposing views when working towards a solution. As an advocate for families and educators, how do you manage the decision-making process when there's no simple, straightforward path to a resolution?
So, unfortunately / fortunately, this is a a lot of what I do in my day-to-day work. At Massasoit Community College, I do a lot of student advocacy, but oftentimes that advocacy is seen as being in contention with something else.
Yep.
Whether it be a disagreement with a faculty member or a family member who doesn't necessarily agree with the way that you know, their brother or their sister, their child is trying to take their life path. And I think what really it dials down to is having as much transparency as possible in the conversation. I think a lot of the disconnect and the disagreement comes from misunderstanding. And that's not to discredit anybody's inability to understand. It's just these are some conversations that have to do with some pretty intense subject matter. And you vote, you hire professionals to come in because they've understood this this language, this culture, and they know based on best practices how to make those decisions. Granted, they may be incredibly tough ones and they may have incredibly tough results to them, but the more that we're able to be transparent with that process and the more that we're able to not just make decisions, but then be able to relay that out to the community so that it doesn't fall on just your layman community member to also understand exactly what happened.
Right.
Because oftentimes they're just seeing the result. They're not seeing the difficult conversation that goes into building that.
Right, yeah. And as a follow-up to that, with the use of social media, which is so widespread, do you see it affecting the decision-making process of the committee in general? And should school committee members actually engage in online discussions or debates?
So I think when it comes to engaging in discussion or debate, you know, I lean back into what the expectations of school committee members and what is written in terms of open forum. I think when you take the individual out of their role as school committee member, they're still a member of the community. They can, you know, vote for whoever they want. They can watch whatever TV shows they want. You know, and that's not to say that there aren't social repercussions of just day-to-day life. You know, my neighbor may put something in their lawn that I don't necessarily agree with. I'll have a reaction to that. But to know that they are a member of the school committee, I think that's an opportunity for us to say, well, there are expectations within the role to talk about things that are not necessary to or you don't necessarily, there are things within the school committee that you're not allowed to bring into conversation outside of that setting. So as long as, you know, you understand whatever social cost that your actions play, whether you feel like it's in support of something or going against something else. But
what if it's setting the record straight? What if something is a statement is made and the school committee voted on something last night and then it's posted exactly opposite of what you voted on? Can't you, as a member of that committee, correct that person? Or
if it was incorrect information that was shared? Sorry, I was asking for a clarification. So if a decision was made in this example last night by school committee and then it was shared out the following day incorrectly. Then I think that there needs to be some level of, obviously, reparation of fixing that communication if it is in fact incorrect. Whether that exists in a social media realm, I think that's a discussion that I think maybe needs to evolve in terms of how school committee operates. Right. We talked about last year, and there's still continuation of just the engagement levels and the avenues in which community members can engage with school committee. And I think it's a two-way street. How does school committee continue to engage outward? And one of the school committee members had a great initiative that kind of broke down our you know, the 2-hour school committee sessions into kind of the digestible and heavy decision-making tidbits for anybody who wasn't able to, you know, watch and present or can't find that 2 hours to be able to sneak it in. So I think there's definitely, and as you know, going back to that technology and how we're trending education-wise, I think it's just, you know, a great opportunity for the school committee to also be trending in a way that is a little bit more, you know, responsive to how technology can be a tool.
Okay, perfect. Excellent, thank you. Okay, question number 3. School budgets can make up a significant percentage of the town's budget. How do you get the best bang for the dollar when balancing the district's contracts, the curriculum, the student needs, the facility upkeep, and current technology, while trying to keep the budget within a reasonable range?
Sure. And I know that that's a big conversation coming up with Duxbury's town meeting later on this month.
Tell me about that.
So there, well, I'll talk specifically about how the school budget weighs in on that. School budget comes in at just below 50% of the town's operating budget, or at least as it's proposed by the town manager. And in December, the schools submitted a proposed budget for level services at an increase of, I believe it was 2.6%, which is, definitely within that range of what yearly increases need to look like. It's usually between 2 and 3% of an increase. But what I really appreciate that the administration did this year was that they did a community poll, and they received about 600-700 responses.
That's great.
That asked community members, what do you feel like the school district needs to, put the money where the mouth is and provide some funding for.
Right.
And that turned into, a level services plus budget of an increase of about 4.6%. So, going from about $39.8 million up to, low 40 million. And then what was proposed by the town manager was a cutback on that a little bit. So level budget, was hit with a little bit extra, but there's this gap of 1%, which translates into about $400,000.
Right.
Which is, you hear 1% and that's one thing, but you hear $400,000 and that's a huge influx of money that can go to support so many additional programs.
Right.
So, going back to that, we have so many different players and so many different resources within the community. When you think, and you have to start thinking creatively with a fixed budget,
right,
you start to lean into those in-kind services. You start to lean into places like the Duxbury Education Fund that can provide, varying level grants to be able to support some of these initiatives. The last thing you want to do is to kind of squash the hope of somebody who is hoping to get an initiative off the ground. And while you may not be able to meet that need 100% financially, you can at least understand, there's comfort in knowing that there are some resources that may exist there for you to be able to build some momentum and lead into an opportunity to then advocate in a following year to the schools and say, this is something that we've piloted. We're able to do it, very low tech, but now we've shown the need, we've shown the desire, and we want to keep growing that. I think additionally, 81% of our school budget goes to salaries.
Right.
So that only leaves, just under 20% left for your year-to-year, your maintenance and whatnot. And all of those are on contracts that, increase year after year.
Right.
And so what I would encourage, or I would continue to support the district in doing, is really looking critically at those year-to-year contracts, especially the ones that are kind of closing their contract end dates, doing market comparisons of what other service providers can come in, give us equal resources, equal level of support, maybe for a better deal.
Can you give me an example of a couple of these contracts you're talking about?
Whether it be through bus transportation or some
These
of the
aren't teacher
additional
contracts.
No, not
These
teacher
are-
contracts at all. These are all outside of any teacher admin admin costs. And ultimately what you want to be able to do is to start to pull some of those funds back, some of that money back, especially for programs that, as we go year after year, some of them may not be serving your community as effectively as they once were.
Right.
And if they're not growing, then you need to find somebody new that can do it.
Right.
And so what I would love to see within the context of being able to reclaim some of that money, get back that, that $400,000 that we, are no longer on the table.
Right.
I would love to see that reinvested back into what I believe is the most critical piece to a successful school community, which is the teachers. Duxbury is no different than what's going on nationally. Teachers are criminally underpaid. And in order to grow a district, you need to keep your talent. You need to foster their development. You need to be able to bring professional opportunities into those spaces. You have to nurture that growth, because that's where you're going to be able to get a community that says, I really resonate with how education is brought to our students. So I would love to see, just, yes, being able to hit those additional programs that maybe got missed in the actual budget that the town is providing, but to also redirect as much of those funds back to the teachers, because that's where the learning happens.
Right.
That's where the relationships are made, and that's where the students are going to really connect with what an educational experience is like.
Exactly. Okay, let me follow up. What significant improvements could be made without using budget funds and being creative with the funding you have? Zero budget stuff. What can you do that doesn't cost anything?
So the zero budget conversation is one I'm very familiar with, coming from the nonprofit world where you had budgets of zero. It was figure out how to make this happen. And I think I mentioned this earlier, I think one of the most untapped resources that we have in Duxbury are its community members. And I think one of the most unfortunate things that I heard throughout my campaign last year was I would go up to somebody and I would, ask them if they'd like to hear about my candidacy for a school committee, and they'd say, I don't have any kids in the system. The school doesn't really mean anything to me. And I'd like to bring them back to that budget and say, well, the town says 50% of what's going into the town goes into the school. So it could and it should mean something, but I think there's another opportunity that education right now has an opportunity to span generations. And I think with a community that is as invested in Duxbury in all of its forms, whether it be sports, academics, culture, I think we have to really lean into some intergenerational learning. I had the fortune of joining the DEI Youth Intergenerational Task Force back in the fall, and it was great to see freshman students, recent high school grads who are still in town, college grads who are in town, professionals, individuals who are retired and just care about it, to all be in the same shared space and having this conversation. And you had students talking about things that at that age I never had the space to be able to share how I felt about, what was going on in my classroom or what was going on in a global context. And to be able to hear that comment and then hear that supported by somebody who's, there's an age gap of maybe 70 years, be able to come in and support. And you just see this incredible moment of learning where it's not just our school age community members that are receiving it, it's everybody that's in that space.
Everybody wins.
Exactly. So I think when we're talking about, what doesn't cost anything, it's our ability to connect with one another. And I think that's something that we really need to lean into. And I think that really does address this feeling that if you don't have kids in the system, then you don't have a connection to the schools, where it's a public school, we're part of the public, it's our school. It's everyone's school, and we should be involved in it.
Okay, good. Question 4. The school district has recently handled some personnel matters in a very public way. In situations like this, how does a school committee member balance the need for transparency and providing information in a timely manner with the need to follow the process and the law?
Absolutely. So I think the law component of that is what you need to lead with, because again, as I've been talking about, we are humans first, and I think there's a human element that needs to be respected. At the same time, I know we're an invested community that wants to know how our educational landscape is going to be navigated and who's going to be at the helm. And when you have individuals who have, spotlight stories that tend to take over community, it's hard to be able to shy away from at least addressing it, or at least having a constructive conversation about it. There is no conversation, though, that can undo what had been done. There's only conversation looking forward to how do we make adjustments and changes, how do we bring in the right individuals, and how do we advocate for our community members to step in and speak up when they feel something incorrect and inappropriate is happening.
Something is amiss.
I think that's, as much as you share out, decision making and deciding to move forward, and again, you will have community response to that, whether it be in favor, whether it be against. And I think, the best you can do is communicate that out and then still respect, again, that privacy, that lawful privacy issue. But I think the biggest thing that we can do is just advocate that everyone should feel comfortable and no one should feel bullied into not being able to speak up when they feel like there's some injustice or something inappropriate that's happening.
Okay. And to follow up with that, when you're handling a sensitive situation like this, how do you keep the trust of the families and the community while at the same time making sure you follow the correct steps, which may not allow for a lot of the information to go public? And that tends to be, I think, the bottom line is, well, what really happened? I want to know exactly what happened, and I deserve to know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard that, or anyone in the school committee has heard that.
Absolutely. I mean, we're human beings. We have a need to know with everything.
Yeah.
And this is no different. And I understand that there's frustration of somebody wanting to know every single detail so that they can feel that same justification in a decision as the decision makers did, because they got to get eyes on it. And I think this is, again, we want to be able to build trust. We want to be able to build that. And that comes from relationship building. That comes from having the same faces involved in the same spaces. So ultimately, how do we get there? It's having as many interactions and having as many engagements as possible. It's not always going to be, the terrible news that we have to gather over.
Right.
There can be some positivity that we as a community get to celebrate. And I think we've kind of, definitely in the last 2 years, there's been a whole lot more to mourn and grieve over than there has been to celebrate. And I'm excited for, again, don't want to jinx anything, but that things are trending back to a pre-COVID type of setting where we can be in those spaces to celebrate. We can be in those spaces to talk about the positive things that are happening. We can begin to see each other as supports rather than obstacles. Because I think there's been this huge just push towards the me versus you, where we really need to get back to the us versus the issue type of approach.
Agreed. Okay, I'm going to ask you a bonus question. What you decide during your time on the school committee will affect the students of tomorrow. How far into the future do you look to see the impact that you could make as a school committee member right now? And I'm really wanting this to be in terms of, how do you decide what curriculums and what things you bring in now that are going to be important 5-10 years from now? For example, we never used to talk about, we always used to talk about kids would always go to college. You got to prep kids to go to college. And now there's a trend moving away from that. What about trade schools? There's all kinds of new things and certificate programs. So talk about that in terms of the curriculum, K through 12. How do you do this?
Absolutely. I am a huge proponent of project-based learning. I think as valuable as a physical classroom is to harbor that learning, getting out into the world, being able to apply critically what you're learning and using it in real-world scenarios, I think is just as, if not more important than being book smart in that subject matter. And absolutely, I think, I was brought up in a system where if you didn't go to a four-year university or if you took a gap year, you were like, well, what's wrong with what happened?
With you, Sean? Yes.
And I definitely, was caught into that. And then it sadly, it took me until I started working in higher education and working in some community colleges and seeing these incredible programs that, are one-year certificate programs or two-year, associate degree programs. And they could be seen as just, stepping stones to, something else, or it could be seen as a space for non-traditional learners to get back into it, or somebody to skill up in a new field that they are excited about. But how that exists at the K through 12 level is give them that exposure, give them that opportunity to get out into the world and do some project-based learning. Engage with individuals who are in some of these trade programs or trade, bring somebody from the IBEW to come by and talk about what it's like to be, an electrician in Boston,
Sure.
or, bring somebody by that, didn't go straight to a four-year university after graduating. I know we have many individuals who have incredible stories, incredible success stories, to be able to share that. And I think we really need to flip the script on what the track is for students, and really let them kind of live and lean into what their passions are. And I think the more that we create those spaces, both within the classroom context, as well as continuing to support that through extracurriculars, I think that's where we'll really start to see like true passion for learning.
Okay, excellent. We have about 4 minutes left, so you're going to have 2 minutes to do your close. So for the other 2 minutes, is there anything you want to talk about that we didn't talk about, or is there anything you want to expand upon?
Sure. There's one piece that I would like to just kind of bring a little bit of light to, and I think that's around equitable treatment of school community members, specifically students. And I know when we come to conversations around discipline, it's always tough because no two students are the same, no two situations are identical, and when you have policies and procedures on how to act when, say, there's a case of student conduct that you need to address, there's always going to be some level of murkiness of, well, why was this the decision when you made this decision for somebody else right here? I think, again, this is a conversation around the misunderstanding and the need for clarity on what that process looks like. Again, still respecting the identities of who participated, but I think as a community, we saw, last year a very terrible incident that happened without any level of community apology. And I know there are people in our community that are still really hurting from not just it happening, but also the lack of apology in any type of public way. Fast forward a few more months and you have individuals from another team, and there was a conduct issue and there was a rather inconsistent sort of punishment that was laid out. And I think that just kind of needs to be addressed in both a way that's equitable, but also an understanding that punitive measures are not the way to foster safe learning environments. We're being hypocritical if we're saying we're student advocates, but we're putting fear in students to not fail in safe environments, whether it be academically or in social contexts. And I think this is an opportunity for some restorative practices to be incredibly helpful for that students can walk away from, conduct or conduct cases without feeling like they just got punished, but rather that they grew from it.
Okay. You got 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Awesome.
To do your close.
Do I stare?
You can stare.
Awesome. I would like to thank everyone in the Duxbury community throughout the last year. As I began this process of joining or running for school committee, I was just met with incredibly warm welcomes, and it gave me an opportunity to see education through a lens of this larger community, whereas I had been on the inside and seeing it through, again, a continued evolving perspective. But at the same time, I leaned heavily into my educational experience. As a former middle school English teacher, as a K through 12 nonprofit education supporter, and now working in higher education, I'm the only candidate that has in-classroom experience, so I know what those conversations look like with students when they're struggling. I'm the only one that has high school or higher education involvement, so I know what those struggles look like when students are transitioning from high school to the collegiate level. I'm there providing supports to make that transition and to ease those pain points, but they're there. And when we look at what's happening at our individual levels of education, we always tend to look back and see what can we do at an earlier level. Well, my ask is that if you want somebody that can support students through that earlier level and can provide them the capacity to support not only themselves, but each other, then I'm the candidate that you should vote for on this upcoming school committee election.
All right. You only went over 2 seconds. Thank you, Sean, for participating in this interview. We wish you the best of luck throughout your campaign and in the election. Today we're speaking with Laurel Deacon, one of the 3 candidates for school committee in the Duxbury town election. Laurel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to go right through the questions. We'll start with question number 1. We have 30 minutes. Okay. One of the many responsibilities of the school committee members is to advocate on behalf of the students and their schools and promote the benefits of the school system to the community. What impression do you want to give of the Duxbury school system, and how would your advocacy showcase all that the district has to offer?
That's a great question. So I think in our district, we are coming up on the opportunity for a brand new strategic plan. And there is a lot of opportunity there for us as a community and a district and for the school committee to actively participate in identifying what we want our goals and objectives to be for the district. And I think in my experience in watching this process over the 10 years that I've lived in town, the joke is always that everyone always asks for more money, right? And it's the job of the school committee to advocate for the resources. And my hope is that the school committee can really become incredibly well educated about the budget process. And again, to have a strategic plan that identifies clearly with input from all stakeholders in the community, because you have to have that buy-in from all members of the community. That's who's voting at town meeting and participating in those discussions, to identify measurable goals and objectives. And I think that's the most difficult part. And I personally don't necessarily have an expert idea about what those goals and objectives should be, but I believe it's the role of the school committee to make sure that that conversation is happening and that the right people are at the table for those conversations. And once those goals and objectives are identified, again, to return to this idea of, are they measurable, and can we tie the budget to those goals and objectives, so that when we come back next year and have this same conversation about the budget again, we can articulate a return on investment for the commitment that the town has made to that budget process.
Okay.
So I think it's sort of a pivotal moment right now, because I know we have that coming down the pike.
The strategic plan.
The strategic plan, exactly.
Okay.
And so that, again, that's the place where we need to articulate those goals. And I think coming out of a pandemic, again, that might look a little bit different than it has in the past.
Yeah.
And we have an opportunity here to decide for the next 3 years, what do we need to focus on to get us back to square one?
Exactly. Now, I'll follow up on this. When you think about the town of Duxbury, we reached out to the community and said, what questions do you want to ask the members that are running for the school committee? And one of the big things was, sports gets an awful lot of press, gets an awful lot of, when you're talking about Duxbury, a lot of times people say, well, they've got a really great sports program. But Duxbury, and of course they do, and it involves a lot of kids, a lot of people are involved in it. But what other things are going on in Duxbury that Duxbury should be known for? What is the out-facing message you want to give about this school district in Duxbury? Right.
I think that's a fantastic question. It's actually what I started thinking about when I went back to moving here and why I chose this district to raise my family. We moved when my daughter was only 2 and had plans to have more children. And obviously, as you would, if you asked most of the community members with young children, why did you move here? Well, for the schools.
Yep.
That's the answer. And so I grew up in a really small public school district, and it was fantastic. I had a great experience in public education, but there weren't a lot of opportunities outside of sports and academics. And so when I looked at Duxbury, I saw lots about music and theater, and now there's a robotics program that has been developed. So there's so much to offer. And to your point, I think athletics often take precedent in the headlines. It's easy to talk about, it's great to have photos of, and all of those things. So I think that's a great opportunity is for the school committee to find ways to highlight the return on investment for things outside of those components. And I think, again, there's no shortage of them, but we need to highlight them more than we have.
Exactly. Okay, question 2. When it comes to decision making, it can be a process to balance opposing views when working towards a solution. As an advocate for families and educators, how do you manage the decision-making process when there's no simple, straightforward path to resolution?
Oh, that's a great question, and one we struggle with every day in our lives, not only on school committee. And I've watched that happen in the school committee meetings. So I think the most that we heard about last year, me as a parent, and in our community, in the climate in which we were operating, was transparency. It's a big word. It's a word people use a lot. But to me, I think that means a transparent environment in which everyone has an opportunity to express their opinion. And I think sometimes the school committee is the place for that, and sometimes it's not. But there are lots of opportunities in our district for that kind of discussion and conversation to happen. But I'm not sure that that has been maximized, and I think there's some opportunity there to do that and to get people talking. And I think there, as a result of this pandemic, there's been some sort of highlights of things that may have been bubbling under the surface, but really were brought to the attention of the community, both parents and educators. And I know for the town of Duxbury, I think we have some rebuilding to do between the parent community and educators. And there are, as I said, places for that to happen,
Right.
but I think we really need to be intentional about amplifying those opportunities and making sure that people feel comfortable coming to the table and having those conversations.
Okay. And let me follow up with that, because this happens all the time with the use of social media and it being so widespread. Do you see it affecting the decision-making process in the school committee? And should school committee members actually engage in online discussions or debates about anything going on in the school system?
Online on social media?
Yeah.
I do not believe that's a place for that because I don't think it's transparent, and I think there's a lot to be left for interpretation, and that's a dangerous place. I think that was part of the issue in the pandemic, is that everyone was at home and living in a little bit of a silo, and we there's a word, this keyboard warrior, right?
Oh yeah.
These people who sort of get in their silos and they're happy to articulate things in social media, but if you ask them to stand up and have a conversation one-on-one or talk to you about those issues, they don't feel comfortable doing that. So what I would say is, if you don't feel comfortable having the conversation in person, then we shouldn't be having the conversation in other avenues.
Okay.
So
what if someone watches a school committee meeting and the next day they go on social media and they say something that is completely not true? Let's say you took a vote and they completely messed it up when they talked about it on social media. Should you correct them? Because that happens a lot also.
I would say that the place to correct them is not in a response on a social media platform. It is a statement from the school committee that clarifies whatever that issue is. And that has happened actually fairly recently, and I think the school committee has been more active in their communication with the parents of the district or the community, whoever's on the listserv that solicits that information, in doing so, and I think that's the right place for it. And then if there is follow-up for that, then it needs to go on an agenda, and there needs to be an opportunity for conversation and for people to know that that's available to them, as opposed to being keyboard warriors.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Question 3. School budgets can make up a significant percentage of the town budget, as we all know. How do you get the best bang for the dollar when balancing the district contracts, the curriculum, the student needs, the facility upkeep, and current technology, while trying to keep the budget within a reasonable range?
A reasonable range. That's a great question. I think I spoke to that a little bit in the first question. But as I said, I think I've worked in the nonprofit sector. I've worked for the state. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned, mostly in my work with United Way and writing grants and things, is this idea of measurable goals and objectives. And if those are clear and you have those, and you can tie the numbers to that, I think it's much easier to have that conversation. And I truly believe, in my experience thus far in our town and in the district, I'm not sure that has been done effectively to be able to advocate for the resources in the way that the school committee is supposed to be responsible for doing. So I have a lot to learn about the budget process, for sure, and I have some great resources in town to do that, and I hope to embrace that as a member of the school committee and have all members actively participate in that process so that we can figure out a direction, because to your point, I think at the end of the day, there's only so many dollars to go around, and when you're advocating for a higher dollar amount for the school budget, it means you have to have a really difficult conversation about where that money is going to come from and what are you pulling it from, and people have very strong feelings about whatever their, is important to them within the town budget, and there's a lot of things in Duxbury.
How do you circle a square of people that don't have kids in the system, which always happens? People age out of the system, or their kids have gone through it and then they're gone, and they become a little bit more not thrilled with the fact that so many dollars go into the school
Fiscally
system.
conservative.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Yes.
and it's understandable. I mean,
Absolutely.
it really is. How will you deal with that type of issue?
Yeah, and I think that's one in Duxbury that comes to the table every single town meeting that we have. And the conversation is always, you know, the people who have a vested interest in the district, who have kids in the district, it's difficult to take a whole day to go to the town meeting and show up, right? And that's always a conversation, but we still have to do that, and we have to encourage people to do so. I think that work has to happen long before town meeting, and it has to happen over the course of the entire budget process, which is a year long. I think sometimes it only comes to light when we start talking about numbers and asking for money.
Right.
And I think that's the error that we're making as a district on some level. And the school committee has to play a role in that. And they have to get buy-in. And I really believe by identifying these measurable goals and objectives, you can do that. And you can articulate why you are asking for these dollars. That's a much easier conversation than just asking every year.
Sure. Now, what about the people that say, what significant improvements could you make, or what could you do within the school system without using dollars? A non-budgeted item. Let's talk about that.
I think there's an opportunity for lots of those. And what I would say is I think I'm not necessarily the expert on that, but I would love to hear the ideas of our educators.
Yep.
So when you talk about, you know, what is the most valuable resource that we have, and yes, they have a salary, and that's important. But when you think back to your own experience in an education system, to me, the most impactful part of my education was a teacher or multiple teachers, right?
Yep.
And I think sometimes we forget that when we start looking at budget line items and where everything goes. And so I think teachers are really struggling right now. And we heard it over the last 2 years a lot of, you know, kind of not feeling like their voices are heard, or, and I think professional development is one of those things where I would love to have more in-depth conversations with our educators about what that means, what is most beneficial to them, because I think that's a big budget line item, and we want to make sure that that is actually being utilized in a way that is effective for those who are receiving that professional development.
Right.
So I think that's a place, but I think, again, it's about having the right people at the table in the conversation to discuss those things. And there's plenty of opportunities, and they have ideas, because I have started to have some of those conversations.
A lot of school districts do this too. They kind of have think tanks where they bring people in and say, what can we do that costs us $0?
Right.
That has an impact.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think there's no shortage, but it's the right
Those
people.
ideas are very important.
They are,
and-
absolutely.
Okay, question 4. The school district has recently handled some personnel matters in a very public way. In situations like this, how does a school committee member balance the need for transparency and providing the information in a timely manner with the need to follow the process and the law?
That is probably the most difficult job and component of school committee, and one that I think people aren't always aware of until they're sitting in that seat. And I've certainly watched it play out over the course of the last year, and often thought about how difficult that situation is. I think the transparency component is key. And I think the most difficult part is obviously someone who comes into the school committee when something like this has already taken place and happened, and you're brought in at a time when perhaps there wasn't transparency prior, and now you're dealing with those consequences. So my hope would be that coming into the school committee position, it would be an opportunity to make sure that starting fresh now, the transparency is there. And to your point, I mean, and I think that's something that, if nothing else, as a school committee member, you have to articulate to the community. There are certain things that we cannot share. This cannot be public information, as much as you want to know and understand.
Yeah, that was one of my follow-ups.
Right, but legally, we can't share this information,
Right.
the specifics.
Right.
Here's what we can share, and I'm happy to entertain questions, but we will be very clear about what questions we can and cannot answer. But when we can't answer questions, we'll be forthcoming with that information. And I don't know if that's always the case. And I think one of the issues is a fear of saying something that you shouldn't, or doing something that you shouldn't.
So how do you, as a school committee member, deal with that? Whether it's a student that sees something and it doesn't feel comfortable, or it's a teacher, or it's a parent, is it your job as the school committee to set the standards for how do you communicate things that are uncomfortable or that you want things followed up on?
I think the school committee has to have a conversation with the administration. That's the avenue. That's my understanding of the avenue for those conversations. That's where you begin. Now, if the school committee determines that that was not an effective method, or they're not receiving the information in a timely manner or in a transparent manner, then that requires follow-up. But I think, again, part of it is having that conversation with the community that here's what we're doing. Here's what we are working on. We are working on this. It's a process. It's not something we're going to be able to deliver back to you, on tomorrow. But know that we are thinking about it and working on it. And, as soon as we have more information for you,
we'll give it out.
We'll give it out.
And how do you set up the scenario so the same things don't happen again? What do you do
to prevent situations like that? Have really transparent conversations about them from the very beginning. And I think it's the school committee's role to be very clear about what transparent means within the rules of the law. And make sure that there's a partnership between the administration and the school committee. And I think that's something that I feel really strongly about. And I think it's a difficult dynamic because you as the school committee are holding the administration accountable. But how do you do that unless you have a strong relationship and a partnership with them? And so my hope would be that if that partnership exists and that trust is there, then you're going to be able to move forward together. While also, as a school committee, representing the interests of the community. That's your role.
And what about the final thing on this question is interaction with parents. Now, school committees, I know some people go to meetings, some people don't. Some people write to you and say, please answer this question. There's always a number of parents that are very vocal. There's a lot of parents that you never hear from. What is your view on parental involvement with all things to do with the school? Because it's a tough balancing act.
It is.
Because sometimes the teachers are acting as parents. Sometimes you have to be the arbitrator between you almost are, school committee can act as parents. How do you respect the position of parents but also draw the line?
That's a wonderful and difficult question. What I would say is in my understanding, and as I'm still learning about the district and the mechanisms in place, there are places for that. And I think the school committee over the course of the last year or two has alluded to them a little bit, but I think it's time to really highlight what's in place for those opportunities. Because to your point, I don't know that school committee is always the place for people to stand up and make a statement about something if it's not something that's related to the agenda that day. But that doesn't mean that it's not important and it doesn't need to be heard. And so there's a system of school councils that were set up, and we have them. And there's a school council at each school, and that's a partnership of parents, educators, administrators, and a community member in each school. And that's by law. They have to be there. Now, whether or not those are being utilized and that resource is being maximized, I think is a question that I have for our district. And it's something that I am hopeful will create a space, because I think that is the place for that. That is the purpose and the intention of those things. And their role is then to obviously report to the school committee and bring up issues that arise. And it's a much more, I think it's more accessible for parents in the community because it's school specific. And then those issues will rise to the school committee as needed.
Makes sense. Okay. Bonus question here. What you decide during your time on the school committee will affect the students of tomorrow. How far into the future do you look to see the impact you could make as a school committee member right now?
How far into the future? I think that's a more complicated question in this moment because of what we've just gone through. I think in my mind right now, I think about focusing on the next 3 to 5 years. The term is 3 years, but I think when you think about a strategic plan and where we're going and what we have to address based on what's happened in the last 2 years, to me that's a manageable view for right now. And once you set the bar for those 3 years, then we have a look back moment of where are we now? Because again, I think it's sort of a pivotal moment. The last 2 years have been unlike anything we have ever experienced.
Absolutely.
And so the conversations and the strategic plan and all of those things are going to be a little bit different, I think, this time around, or I believe that they should be.
Right.
And then you revisit that and plan for the next 10.
Okay, based on the
previous three.
Let me put this one to you. Over the past decade or so, the focus for post-secondary education has shifted from the traditional, you're going to apply to college, you're going to go to college, we're going to get you ready for college, to options that include the trades and even certificate programs. So knowing that that landscape of after high school has changed dramatically, especially in the job market, and especially since COVID has happened, how should that be affecting your decisions on curriculum, on where the district should be bringing these students to look 5 and 10 and 15 years into their future?
That's a great question. I think the landscape is changing, and I think the community is aware of that. And I think the unique opportunity we have in Duxbury is it is a small community, and it's a place where you truly could engage a broad range of members of the community to talk about that. But I think at the end of the day, it's really the students that we should be speaking to about this and what their ideas about goals and objectives for their own educational experience are. And I'm talking, you know, starting in middle school, you begin to have those conversations, and the guidance counselors are having those conversations, but I'm not sure that those conversations are making it to the ears of those who are making the decisions about policies and what our measurable goals and objectives are. So I think, again, it's about having conversations and discussions and having all of the stakeholders involved in those. And I think students are sometimes left out of these conversations when actually they're the most important, because they're those are the people that we're working for.
It's their future.
It's their future, right? So let's ask them. Let's ask them about their future and what their ideas are for what that looks like and what they want to achieve. And I think we have this vision of, you know, achieving academic excellence, personal and academic excellence is our mission at DPS. And that's a great statement, but what does that mean? What does that mean to each respective group? And I think we need to ask that question to determine our strategic plan and what that looks like. And students, I am hopeful that we can engage students in that conversation.
Yeah. I mean, you alluded to the robotics club, things like that, you know, 10, 15 years ago, there was no robotics club. Coding, I mean, it's just, and you don't have to go to college anymore. To some of these careers that people are walking into, they don't require a 4-year degree. Not that there's anything wrong with it. 4 years degrees are wonderful, but they're not always necessary. But do you think that overall curriculum has lagged behind what is actually the reality of what's out there?
I think the perception of what education is supposed to be has lagged behind. And I think Duxbury is no different. I think that's happened everywhere. It's moving at lightning speed, and we haven't really caught up yet. And so, again, I keep using this, there's like a pivotal moment here, and it's exciting and a little scary, I think, for everybody to have that in front of them and have to have those conversations. But it's time. It's time for that. And I think, and again, but you have to gain buy-in from everybody, because to your point, there's a broad range in our community of people who might not understand the value of the robotics club right now. So let's talk about that.
And to your point, it's all come back to the budget and how you're going to budget this and your measurable goals and objectives. So let's look at robotics 5 years from now. What do they do over the last 5 years?
Absolutely. And what is the return on investment for that? And I don't think it's hard to make that case, but you have to make that case.
That's right. Okay, we have about 5 minutes. So why don't you let us know anything that we didn't bring up that you wanted to talk about before we do your closing statement? Or do you want to clarify or go back to any of the questions?
I think they were great questions. Thank you for asking.
Sure.
I don't think there's anything that we didn't talk about. I think, you know, in our community, obviously, I've put out a lot of information about what I think is important and why I'm running. And I hope those are accessible. And they will be. They'll be in the Clipper. They'll be all over town for the next 3 weeks. And I would hope that people would reach out. I think that's the most important thing to me, is to hear from the community. It's really what I feel most strongly about in terms of my role on the school committee and serving as a bridge between the community and our district. So I think driving home that point and making sure that people understand that that's where I'm coming from when I talk about running for school committee.
All right. Do you want to just talk into the camera for a second and just give a little bit of your bio as to what brought you here and why you are running?
Sure. I have been a resident of Duxbury for almost 12 years now, and I think truthfully that is what is the most valuable experience in terms of what I can bring to the table in my campaign for school committee. I am also a mother of 3. I can't leave that out. I think it's also incredibly important. I have a 12, 9, and 6-year-old in Duxbury Public Schools. I also was a coach in the high school. But again, to come back to this idea of being an active member of the community. And I have been involved in lots of organizations, not only the schools, but the Duxbury Music Festival, and the Duxbury Education Foundation, and volunteering for the PTA, and all of those things have really provided me with the experience that I think is most valuable to bring to the school committee. And so that is why I'm running. It's been pretty clear in all of my statements about that's how I look at the value of my role as a candidate.
Okay. Thank you, Laurel. For our viewers, thank you for joining us. If you're interested in watching replays of this interview, please visit our website, pactv.org/elections, for replay times and online viewing options, including PAC TV's on-demand and streaming service, PAC TV Prime. And please make your choices heard by voting in the election on Saturday, March 26th. Thank you and good day.